What will happen to Donald Trump if media challenge his transparency claims? Donald Trump has long built his political brand on the promise of being transparent, yet when the media actually takes a closer look, the cracks in that image begin to show. From unanswered questions about finances to shifting explanations in court cases to carefully staged press events that reveal less than they conceal, journalists are starting to push back harder than ever. If the media continues challenging his claims of transparency, it could trigger a battle not just over Trump's credibility, but over how much accountability a former president owes the American public. The stakes are high, and the fallout could reshape the political landscape. Stay tuned as we break it down right now. The question of transparency has been at the heart of American political life for decades, and in recent years it has become inseparable from debates around Donald Trump. His press conferences often emphasize that his administration has been the most transparent in history. In the Oval Office press conference under review, Trump repeatedly described himself as transparent, while at the same time making a series of controversial and sometimes legally questionable statements. The disconnect between words and actions opens a space for media scrutiny. The role of the press in challenging these claims of transparency is critical, not only for accountability in the moment, but also for shaping how history will remember a presidency. The purpose of this analysis is to explore what could happen if media institutions rigorously confront Trump's transparency narrative. Transparency is more than a political slogan. In democratic governance, it means making decisions and processes accessible to public scrutiny. Transparency ensures that citizens, scholars, and watchdog organizations can evaluate the actions of leaders against the standards of law and ethics. For presidents, transparency usually involves public access to policy documents, clear explanations of executive decisions, and honesty in reporting both successes and failures. Media institutions are designed to test claims of transparency by asking difficult questions, uncovering inconsistencies, and comparing rhetoric to reality. When Trump says we are so transparent, the immediate question becomes, transparent about what? Transparency cannot be claimed in the abstract. It requires evidence. Without the release of documents, without disclosure of decision-making processes, and without consistency in factual accuracy, such claims risk becoming political theater rather than democratic practice. The press conference in question was remarkable for several reasons. First, Trump announced that he was signing an executive order to rename the Department of Defense as the Department of War. This action, however, is not within presidential authority, since renaming a cabinet department requires congressional legislation. Second, he made several unusual remarks, such as comparing grass to human life, confusing an American flag for a blanket, and attributing economic fluctuations to both his own policies and to his political rival. These moments captured public attention and raised questions about coherence and factual reliability. Finally, Trump returned again and again to the theme of transparency, despite simultaneously making statements that left reporters and observers with more questions than answers. The juxtaposition of repeated transparency claims with opaque or confusing statements is what makes this press conference such an important case study. If the media respond by challenging his narrative, the effects could ripple across public opinion, legal debates, and historical legacy. When media organizations confront political claims, they often employ several strategies. In Trump's case, 4 main avenues of challenge can be identified. First, fact-checking. Journalists can systematically compare Trump's statements with established facts. For example, when Trump says the Department of Defense was renamed after World War II because it became too woke, reporters can point out the actual legislative history. This type of correction strengthens the public record. Second, contextual analysis. Media can place Trump's comments about wars, the economy, or the environment within broader historical and policy frameworks. Explaining why renaming a department requires congressional approval is not an attack, but rather an act of clarification that reinforces democratic norms. Third, investigative reporting. Claims of transparency invite requests for documents and records. If Trump insists that nothing is being hidden, media institutions can ask for the release of specific materials, such as financial disclosures, visitor logs, or in this case, the Epstein files he referenced indirectly. The act of requesting evidence tests the sincerity of transparency rhetoric. Fourth, Editorial commentary. Media outlets often use opinion pages and broadcast analysis to explain why inconsistencies in leadership matter. These are not partisan attacks, but reasoned interpretations that help the public understand potential consequences of misleading statements. When Donald Trump repeatedly frames himself as the most transparent leader in history, the claim does not exist in isolation. It intersects directly with American legal traditions and the institutional balance of power that defines the U.S. Constitution. If the media choose to challenge these claims seriously, one of the first outcomes could be a renewed national debate about presidential authority, constitutional checks, and the legal framework surrounding executive decisions. Take, for example, Trump's assertion that he could unilaterally rename the Department of Defense to the Department of War. On the surface, it might sound like a branding exercise. In reality, it carries significant constitutional implications. Under U.S. law, presidents do not have the power to unilaterally change the name or structure of a cabinet-level department. Such an action requires congressional approval. If journalists press this point and consistently highlight the legal reality, it reinforces public understanding of the separation of powers. The Constitution deliberately divides authority between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches to prevent the rise of unchecked power. By drawing attention to this fact, the media help defend a cornerstone of American democracy. The same logic applies to Trump's other statements, such as suggesting the deployment of federal troops to American cities or hinting at military retaliation against foreign aircraft without congressional consultation. In both cases, the War Powers Act and related statutes require a level of legislative oversight. If the press consistently emphasizes these legal frameworks, it exposes the tension between rhetoric and constitutional process. That tension matters deeply because it shapes whether the public views the president's words as bold leadership or as a breach of democratic norms. Transparency also extends into areas of ethics and governance. When Trump claims that hosting the G20 at his Doral property would not generate personal profit, the statement raises clear conflict of interest concerns. Federal ethics laws and long-standing traditions seek to prevent presidents from using public office for private gain. Journalists who investigate these claims do more than critique political spin. They reinforce institutional checks and balances that protect the integrity of government. In short, legal and institutional consequences of media scrutiny are not abstract. They are practical safeguards of democracy. The political consequences of sustained media challenges to Trump's transparency narrative are layered and complex. On one level, they can directly affect public trust. For undecided voters or moderates who are less committed to partisan loyalties, repeated exposure to contradictions may erode confidence. For instance, if Trump claims that the economy is at historic highs while also conceding that significant recovery will not occur until years into the future, careful reporting of the inconsistency can lead citizens to question reliability. When trust and accuracy declines, political momentum can weaken. On another level, media scrutiny may intensify partisan polarization. Many of Trump's core supporters have historically dismissed unfavorable coverage as media bias. When journalists highlight discrepancies in transparency claims, this group may become even more entrenched in its defense of the former president. However, while polarization can be a predictable outcome, it does not nullify the value of fact-checking. The broader electorate, including independents and swing state voters, benefits from a clearer picture of the facts. Even if some audiences reject the reporting, others may find the contrast between rhetoric and reality persuasive. A further consequence lies in campaign dynamics. If transparency becomes a prominent theme in media coverage, political opponents may capitalize on it. Rival candidates can frame themselves as champions of openness and accountability, drawing a sharp contrast with Trump's contested record. In this way, media scrutiny indirectly shapes the battlefield of electoral politics. It provides material for debates, informs voter priorities, and even influences how campaign messaging is crafted. Transparency, once a rhetorical advantage, can become a vulnerability if the press highlights inconsistencies effectively. Beyond domestic politics, the issue of transparency reverberates internationally. American presidents do not operate in isolation. Their words and actions are watched closely by allies, rivals, and global institutions. If Trump's transparency claims are scrutinized and challenged in major international outlets, the perception of U.S. leadership may shift in significant ways. Consider the example of misstating historical timelines or asserting authority he does not legally possess. To domestic audiences, these may appear as political exaggerations. To foreign governments, however, they raise questions of credibility and reliability. International partners rely on American commitments to structured trade agreements, defense alliances, and diplomatic initiatives. Transparency is part of that trust. If media scrutiny demonstrates that U.S. rhetoric and legal reality diverge, allies may become more cautious in negotiations, while adversaries may view the situation as an opportunity to exploit uncertainty. Diplomatic credibility is not built solely on military strength or economic size. It also rests on the belief that the U.S. government operates within stable, transparent, and predictable norms. When journalists challenge claims that deviate from those norms, they contribute to safeguarding America's international reputation. If the press fails to challenge such claims, the risk is that confusion at home translates into skepticism abroad. In today's interconnected world, the consequences of media scrutiny, or its absence, extend well beyond Washington, shaping America's role on the global stage. History provides instructive lessons about what happens when presidential claims are scrutinized. Richard Nixon declared his administration transparent even during the Watergate scandal, but investigative journalism revealed otherwise, leading to resignation. Ronald Reagan often spoke of transparency in foreign policy, yet the Iran-Contra affair demonstrated the risks of secrecy. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama each faced scrutiny over transparency, whether related to financial dealings, intelligence reports, or drone warfare disclosures. The pattern is clear. When the press challenges transparency narratives, it can alter presidential legacies. For Trump, similar scrutiny could determine whether history remembers him as candid or as inconsistent. Several scenarios can be outlined for what might happen if media organizations persistently challenge Trump's transparency claims. Scenario 1 is defensive escalation. Trump may respond by doubling down on rhetoric, labeling media as dishonest, and attempting to restrict access. While this may rally core supporters, it risks further alienating institutions that rely on open communication. Scenario 2 is forced disclosure. Under sustained media pressure, Trump might release documents or data to prove transparency. If the information aligns with his claims, it could strengthen his position. If not, it could backfire. Scenario 3 is narrative fatigue. Over time, constant media scrutiny may lead to public fatigue, where audiences simply tune out. In this case, Trump's claims and media counterclaims cancel each other out, leading to limited political impact. Scenario 4 is historical documentation. Even if immediate political consequences are modest, media challenges ensure that records exist for future historians. This means Trump's transparency claims will be evaluated not by rhetoric alone, but by evidence preserved in investigative journalism. Transparency is not just a word. It is a principle that underpins democracy. When Donald Trump claims unparalleled transparency, media institutions have both the right and the responsibility to test those claims. If they do so consistently, several outcomes are possible. Clarification of legal authority, reinforcement of institutional checks, influence on electoral politics, impact on international credibility, and long-term historical judgment. The intersection of transparency claims and media scrutiny is therefore not a minor issue, but a defining aspect of contemporary governance. What will happen to Donald Trump if the media challenge his transparency claims? The most likely result is a combination of short-term political controversy and long-term historical assessment. In the short run, scrutiny may expose inconsistencies and fuel debate about leadership style. In the long run, it will contribute to the historical record that defines Trump's legacy. Transparency claims invite accountability, and when accountability is applied, the public gains a clearer picture of truth. That is the essence of democratic responsibility.